Welcome everyone to the Score Fantasy Football Podcast presented by Subway. I'm your host, Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at The Score. And with me today, as always, David P. Woods, a man who was recently told on Twitter that he sounds like Chiefs star quarterback Patrick Mahomes. Woods, have you ever gotten that before?
That was the first time. I mean, I love hearing from listeners. I can't really do a whole lot about my voice. I think you're kind of bearing the lead there. I was also mentioned that I sound like another famous individual in that same feedback.
Well, Kermit the Frog was also mentioned. I wasn't going to say it, but yeah.
Yeah, do I sound like Kermit the Frog?
I a little bit. I could see. I went and listened to a bunch of Mahomes clips after I saw that, and I don't totally agree. I kind of see what they're talking about, but I don't totally agree with them.
It's all right. My voice is my voice. I'm happy to be compared to two stars like that. Kermit, an all-time great frog, and Patrick Mahomes, well on his way to being an all-time great football player. I'll take it.
All right, well, on today's episode, I'm going to run through some of the notable updates that you're going to see in my rankings on Thursday, and then we're going to preview Week 7 with the fantasy hitman himself, Mike Wright of the Fantasy Footballers. We're going to see what he thinks about some of the biggest questions as we are heading into Week 7, and we're going to also break down some of the two-man backfields that are just giving headaches to fantasy owners out there. Really tough to predict some of those every week. We'll see if we can help you out with that. And then we're going to wrap things up with some players who we think are going under the radar this week that you can maybe get into your fantasy lineups. But first, as I mentioned, my updated rankings are going to be available on The Score on Thursday. Let's take a first look at some of the notable risers and fallers that you're going to see in our Next Level Update segment, which is presented by our friends at Subway, who upped the taste ante with their new Next Level Paninis. I have moved Matt Breida down to running back 26. It's a 5-spot drop. I think we were all really impressed with his toughness that he was able to play in that game Monday night. It seemed like he was doubtful all week long. He performed pretty well in that game. Got, shined a little overshined by Raheem Mostert, but just the fact that he was able to play in that game was pretty impressive. And I think that might have swayed me a little bit. I was working on the rankings Monday night, and when you look at his matchup this week, going up against the Rams, that's going to be a tough one for San Francisco, especially on a short week, so temper your expectations for Breida. I moved Mike Evans down a couple spots here just to a borderline wide receiver 1, and that's because, well, the matchup looks good with the Browns as a whole for that offense. They've actually been deploying rookie Denzel Ward in shadow coverage, and that's happened the last few weeks. And Evans has been held under 60 yards in the last 2 games, so a couple things working against him there. Jameis seems to be spreading the ball around quite a bit in his 6 quarters or so that he's played. So I bumped Evans' projection down slightly. Last one here, I moved Christian Kirk up to wide receiver 42. His chemistry with Josh Rosen's evident. He's got 77 yards or more in 3 of his last 4 games. And we're seeing Larry Fitzgerald slowed by injury a little bit. Kirk starting to emerge in that offense. And the Broncos' pass defense, they aren't world beaters anymore. So they've given up some pretty big games recently. Robert Woods, Robbie Anderson, John Brown, Amari Cooper. Those guys have all had good games against them this year. And Kirk has another chance for a solid outing in this one. If you want to see my full rankings, that update is going up on the Score app on Thursday. Today's guest, as I mentioned, is a member of the Fantasy Footballers. They're an entertaining trio of fantasy analysts that consists of Jason Moore, Andy Holloway, and our guest today, Mike Wright, the Fantasy Hitman. He's on Twitter at FFHitman. Mike, thanks for joining us. How you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. I appreciate the invite. I am delighted to jump on this show with you fellas.
Well, I really hope that I didn't insult the other 2 guys by picking you. I mean, I've had more conversations with you. We've done some mock drafts and stuff together. So I hope that there was no offense taken by the other 2 that we went with you for this.
Look, sometimes you got to just call a spade and take the best one of the 3, and you succeeded. And I'm here.
Absolutely. Good stuff. I think this week it makes the most sense to start with what's one of the biggest stories that came out this week, and that's Devonta Freeman placed on IR. It's been a lost season for him, just a ton of injuries, unfortunately. And anytime a running back goes down, it creates opportunity in fantasy. With Freeman out, we've already seen a pretty good sample size from that backfield. Tevin Coleman, Ito Smith, they're sharing that backfield right now. So, Mike, I'm looking how are you valuing Coleman and Smith this week? They have the Giants, so just this week and maybe rest of the season as well.
Sure. So Tevin Coleman, he'll be that low end running back one for me, I'm sure. Come Sunday, I'm with you. I'm tweaking the rankings all week. I think Ito Smith is the big story of this. People who they drafted Coleman, they're super happy that they have a very tangible starter now. But Ito Smith is very intriguing. A huge pass catching profile coming out of college, and that's really a key thing that I look for when I'm looking at my running backs, seeing how projected them, how they're going to do in the NFL. You're right that when the game is just Coleman and Ito Smith, the snap share is very reminiscent of when it was just Freeman and Coleman. I think he's going to be worked into the offense more and more. They trust him in the red zone. I mean, he's one of the leaders of carries inside of the 20. I think he had like one fewer carry inside the 10 than Melvin Gordon. He's getting a ton of opportunity, and I think that he's actually a good player. So I went hard after him in all of my leagues. In the league that I play with the footballers, unfortunately, I lost out by $1 to
Ouch.
Jason. And that stabbed me right in the stomach, because I think that the future is very, very bright for Ito Smith, and we're approaching the time where there aren't many opportunities or scenarios where a waiver wire running back is going to be worth a huge amount of your fab. And I think Ito Smith is a fantastic pickup. It won't shock me to see him as a running back, low end running back too, with upside every single week for the rest of the season.
Woods, did you try to get Smith anywhere?
Yeah, I did. You know what? I think I honestly might kind of prefer Smith to Coleman. It's just the idea that Smith sort of will step into that Freeman role, and that role has maybe been a little more profitable in fantasy over the years. Smith still has some stuff to prove, but the Falcons are giving him the ball a lot. I mean, 11 carries last week. He scored a rushing touchdown in 3 straight games. And I'm just trying to project forward. I mean, this is probably a lost season for the Falcons. They're not going to the playoffs. Freeman was put on IR, I think, in part to preserve his health for next season when they can take another run at it. And Coleman's going to be a free agent at the end of the year. I think we can confidently assume that he won't be back because Freeman has a big contract, and I'm not sure the Falcons can afford Coleman also. So that means Freeman and Smith are probably the future there. And I've just been sort of trying to figure out what does that mean for how they're going to deploy their running backs for the rest of the season. Now, one theory might be they'll use up Coleman because they're going to let him walk and they want to get as much value out of him as possible. But I think it's just as likely, if not more likely, that they're going to really see what they have in Smith. And they'll know going into next season, do we need to draft another running back to pair with Freeman, or is Freeman and Smith a duo we can move forward with? So I think that perhaps means a lot of work for Smith going forward, and he's someone I'm pretty interested in.
I don't disagree with you guys. I do think his workload is going to go up a little bit here. I do question, though, we haven't really seen the yardage from him. So far this year, dating back here, 54 total yards, 35, 38, 10, 21. I know the touchdowns are there, and I know the goal line work is obviously exciting. I just think, to me, he looks more like, and I compared the duo at this point to the Ravens guys, to Alex Collins and Tevin Coleman playing that Alex Collins role, and then Javorius Allen comparing more to Ito Smith playing as a pass catcher and a goal line back. And we've seen with Allen, he's not putting up huge yardage. He ends up being more of a touchdown or bust sort of flex play, which is interesting, definitely, rosterable. I just think he's going to have to see a lot more touches here. And maybe it happens, like you said, Woods, like maybe that will happen as the year goes along and they want to see what they have there. I just, at the moment, I'm looking at him more as a flex play as opposed to maybe a low-end RB2 like Mike mentioned. The same sort of situation, we saw this kind of happen about a week ago in Philadelphia, right? Jay Ajayi goes on IR. Everybody hustles out to try to get Corey Clement. They try to get Wendell Smallwood. And, we saw them play last week. It was, I think it kind of went as people expected. We saw, 14 touches, 69 yards, and a score for Clement. Smallwood saw more work. He had 19 touches, but only 51 yards in that game. So, Mike, after seeing the one game, did it change your opinion all on how Clement and Smallwood are going to be valued in fantasy the rest of the way? And what do you think? Are you looking at starting either of them going against Carolina this week?
It did not change things for me. Clement was the guy that I preferred and seeing the way that he was actually used in the game, it gave me full confidence to love him as a fantasy running back moving forward. It came out, right before the game. I was scrambling. I don't know if you guys were, but right before the game, we're going to put Corey Clement on a snap count. And it's like, where was this news? Philadelphia beat reporters, we're relying on you. And you saw it. Wendell Smallwood started the game, but when it got down and they got close to the end zone, they went to Corey Clement. I think that the workload being in Smallwood's favor was more just a factor of Clement's injury, how he was still recovering, and it was the Thursday night game, so they knew they had that kind of not a real bye week, but the 10 days off. So let's get Smallwood out there. He's competent, but Corey Clement is by far the better running back in my opinion, and it's hard to get running backs on a high-powered offense. I know it's a committee. I don't project that Corey Clement's just going to run away with the job, but that's not a huge deal. I mean, look at the landscape of the running back position. Other than maybe 4 or 5 guys, everyone's in a running back committee. This is the new normal for fantasy running backs. We need to eliminate, in my opinion, committee being a dirty word for fantasy running backs because they're all in them. So Corey Clement, the leader of his committee, I think is a very valuable fantasy running back, especially as Carson Wentz looks like he's getting his groove back to make the Eagles a high-powered offense again.
I totally agree with you, and thanks for helping me reminisce last Thursday. I was one of the foolish people that at the last minute I was like, I'm gonna move him up my rankings, and I moved Smallwood up after that news came out.
I did the exact same thing,
just devastating. I took Clement out of a lineup. It was just a nightmare. And sometimes it works out the other way, right? You get that last minute. I had Kenyan Drake had a good game a couple weeks ago, and I had heard in the last 10 minutes before kickoff one of the sideline reporters saying that the Dolphins players were talking about watch out for our run game today. All right, I moved Drake up. That one worked out. This one obviously didn't at all. Let's stick, though, with some of these two-headed backfields, and, we won't call them committees. We won't, use that dirty word.
It's not a bad word. This is what it is, man.
I know.
Fantasy running backs.
There's so few, and it shows how valuable some of those workhorse backs are now in fantasy. Let's stick with another one here, though, and a guy who was a workhorse over the first month of the season, and that was Alvin Kamara. Then Mark Ingram comes back off suspension in week 5. Kamara only saw 9 touches in that game at 39 yards. Ingram's the one that led the way. He had 18 touches, 73 yards from scrimmage, had 2 touchdowns. I know a lot of owners were panicking going into that bye week in week 6. Is this going to be, is Kamara's ceiling capped now? And, some people asking me, should I be trading Alvin Kamara? I think that's a little crazy. I think we know what his ceiling is. We saw the two of them play together. So what's your take here? Do you think that, is it possible that this was just Kamara had a few nagging injuries and Sean Payton saw the bye week coming and said, you know what, we can get away with not using him too much in this game, leans on Ingram, and then we're going to see Kamara and Ingram go back to, what we saw near the end of last year, which was Kamara taking the lead in that backfield and Ingram sort of playing a complementary role? Or should fantasy owners actually be worried that maybe Kamara's ceiling's a little lower now with Ingram back?
I'm with you that the trading of Kamara is just absolutely ridiculous. After that performance, I mean, I don't know what happened to your timeline, but mine filled with people just panicking of, I got to sell Kamara right now? And we said on our show, on the Footballers, we said, if you got David Johnson, you go right now to the Alvin Kamara owner and say, hey, you want to make a trade? Because I would 100% rather have Alvin Kamara. If you thought what was happening in those first few weeks was what Alvin Kamara was going to do every single week, then you were living in denial. You were lying to yourself in the mirror by thinking that Alvin Kamara was going to get 19 rushing attempts every single week. They showed us who they were last year. It's going to go back to it, like you alluded to. Kamara was on the injury report that kind of the whole week leading up to the game. We didn't really take into account because you knew he was going to play. You didn't realize, though, that Peyton was looking at the bye week saying, well, we'll just have fresh legs Mark Ingram go and handle everything. I expect everything to return back to normal, where both Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram are sensational plays at the running back position. Maybe not. Maybe the shine is off a little bit because the passing ratio for the Saints is returning. Last year it was the 1-to-1 ratio of the rushing touchdowns, the passing touchdowns, just a complete outlier to Drew Brees and his entire history playing quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. So maybe a little bit of that is gone from Kamara, but he's still an elite level fantasy running back. And Mark Ingram is that high level too, who is going to have 4 or 5 weeks where he just goes off.
I mean, I think you guys nailed it. No one should have been surprised by this, frankly.
No, not at all.
We knew Kamara was going to get a huge workload during Ingram's suspension, and we knew he was probably going to get that lesson when Ingram came back. I think this was probably the plan, and it actually maybe worked out perfectly for Kamara, and then he got a lot more rest in that 1 week. Like you said, only 9 touches than maybe he should have. And he's going to come back this week way more refreshed than he was expected to be and should step right back into his role before. But that also means he's going to have decreased value from the first few weeks of the season with Ingram suspended. And again, no one should be surprised from that. Ingram's going to play a role. But as we saw last year, they can both have plenty of fantasy value. So I honestly think there's a scenario where Ingram scores another couple touchdowns this week kind of thing, and Kamara owners are still panicking and saying, I got to trade him. You may have to ride this out a little bit, but we know this is a good offense, and we're pretty confident how these running backs are going to be used, so just stay on them, and they're going to score fantasy points for the rest of the season. I mean, they're going to pile up by the end of the year.
So we all seem to agree on that backfield. What about the Dolphins backfield, though? And I mentioned Drake earlier. We've seen, Frank Gore. They're basically splitting carries almost evenly now. Gore had 100 yards last week. No one saw that coming. Drake's been, underperforming like crazy. Gore has at least 12 touches in his last 3 games. Drake lost a pretty bad fumble at the goal line last week. That just added to his misery. Mike, do you trust either of them as fantasy starters at this point?
Nope.
That's it. We don't even need to discuss it.
That's all I wrote down. You. Nope. I wrote down one word here.
Even that they're going against the Lions, and the Lions' run defense has not been very good. So it could, and with so many owners, we have 4 teams on bye this week, so people are looking for options. Not a scenario where you would start either of them.
Frank Gore in full desperation. Generally speaking, I want the running back who's maybe he's on the lower side of the timeshare, but he's the pass catcher. Not here with Kenyan Drake. Frank Gore's workload has just been going up the past 3 weeks. He's infinite. He's Frank Gore. He will not stop. He'll be playing football in the year 2045 and scoring touchdowns that year as well. It's if I have to choose between them, we're at a weird place in fantasy football this year, but I'm going with Frank Gore over Kenyan Drake.
Well, I mean, it's not just Miami's backfield, though, right? Even their whole offense has been tough to predict. It didn't help having Brock Osweiler under center last week.
I was going to say, I just got breaking news that Brock will be starting again.
Yeah, I saw that too. It just came out. Brock will be starting this week. And I think last week we thought he was just going to get mauled by that Bears defense. And guess what? 380 yards, throws for 3 touchdowns. But Kenny Stills, Albert Wilson, even Jakeem Grant, they've all had big games at different moments. With the situation, though, at quarterback there, I don't think we can trust Osweiler. It was sort of a surprise game last week, maybe caught that Bears defense off guard. Is there anyone in the receiving core that you would be willing to start at this point?
To be fair, I think even Brock Osweiler's parents were surprised that he had a big game against the Bears. If I'm going to play anyone from the wide receiver core of the Dolphins, I'm chasing the points of Albert Wilson. He should have a pretty good matchup with his physical attributes against a Tabor, who he should be matched up against with Detroit for most of his snaps. So if I'm going in, I'm chasing the big play. Kenny Stills has been incredibly disappointing thus far through the season, and I think the trust in Wilson is just growing and growing. It's that there's the chasing of the narrative for backup quarterbacks and the perceived backup wide receiver, which Albert Wilson coming into the year was the backup wide receiver, which was strange considering they gave him that contract. I know it's a fun narrative, but in my experience, it does pay off more than it doesn't. So if I'm going to take one, it's Albert Wilson.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the big things is just targets, right? And we saw last week Wilson with 9 targets. That was more than he had seen all season. If he's getting that kind of volume, the talent is there for him to do something with it. So I'm with you on that one. Osweiler's not the only backup QB that had some success last week, though. CJ Beathard, he has done his best to keep that 49ers offense going, to keep some of those skill position players afloat in fantasy. He had multiple touchdown passes in his last 3 games. Another one I don't think we saw coming. Marquise Goodwin obviously had a huge game last week. 6 catches, 129 yards, caught both those touchdowns. And he's finally healthy. That helps. And we also saw, as I mentioned before, the running backs, they had some success on the ground last week. Is it possible, Mike, that Beathard, when he's under center, we thought might all fall apart here? Is it possible he can keep the 49ers fantasy viable the rest of the way?
If Marquise Goodwin is healthy, then yes. That's the key. I bought into the breakout. I thought it was real this past year. What Marquise Goodwin was able to do, show that he's not just a one-dimensional. Now I know that one dimension worked very well for Marquise Goodwin this past week, but I think he's actually a very good wide receiver, but he's fragile, and it will be, I think, a miracle if he can make it through the rest of the season without getting banged up again. So, to me, it's as Goodwin goes, that's as C.J. Beathard goes, and the San Francisco offense as a whole goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some value here too. In part, it all goes back to Kyle Shanahan, who I have a lot of faith in as a very good coach who elevates his players. Beathard was a chosen quarterback of Shanahan in that draft, and I think Beathard he's all right. So, like Mike said, I'd be confident starting Marquise Goodwin as long as you can be confident that he's healthy. I'd be happy playing George Kittle at this point. I think with all the injuries at tight end, he's a top 5 option maybe going forward. And, as long as Brady is healthy there, I think you're starting him too. So there's some value in an offense that only a few weeks ago we thought was maybe just a wasteland.
Well, they're definitely going to get a tough test this week. They're 9.5-point underdogs to the Rams. And on that Rams side, they're dealing with injuries as well. Cooper Kupp overcame a concussion the week before, was able to play last week, suffered what looked like a horrific injury, turned out to be a sprained MCL. He's not going to go this week. At least Sean McVay, he said he doesn't expect that he's going to be able to play this week. So, Mike, who's going to step up in that Rams offense? Well, the targets, are they just going to get distributed amongst the stars, Gurley, Woods, Cooks? Are we going to see a guy that I know Woods and I have talked about him a few times on the podcast, Josh Reynolds? Is he going to finally get his opportunity? Or even Gerald Everett? He's got a lot of talent as a pass-catching tight end. I could see McVay maybe finding a way to get him involved, playing him in the slot a little bit. Who do you think's going to step up with Kupp out this week?
Josh Reynolds has an opportunity, absolutely, but I feel like he's been looking in the face of opportunity several times, only to have Sean McVay replace it with somebody else. There's clearly not a ton of faith in Josh Reynolds, he's an okay player. He might be able to fill in. Gerald Everett is the player I'm hopeful and more excited for. The history. I read into this. Maybe it's foolish of me. They didn't have a first-round pick, Sean McVay's very first year in the league, and they took Gerald Everett in the second round. The first ever draft pick under the Sean McVay regime was a tight end, and we had seen Sean McVay working magic with Jordan Reed. They almost play Cooper Kupp as this weird wide receiver tight end hybrid. The way that they line him up, he's a ginormous man playing a slot wide receiver position. So it would be, I think it's in the realm of possibilities, and would be really, really awesome if we could see Gerald Everett just get things going. He's a mountain of a man. We call him Mount Everett on our show. His athletic measurables are off the charts. He's a beast, and maybe this is just me being more hopeful than I am being a good fantasy analyst, but I think that Gerald Everett will be the beneficiary with Cooper Kupp out.
I think Boone and I are both fans of Everett as a prospect.
Definitely.
I think probably the most likely scenario for the Rams is that Josh Reynolds will step in and play basically every snap that their receivers would have played. I mean, they play so much 11 personnel. That's 3 wide receivers on the field. I think Reynolds is going to go outside, and I think maybe what we're going to end up seeing, perhaps most likely, is that Robert Woods shifts more into the slot and handles some of those Kupp targets, and that he ultimately is the biggest beneficiary. So it's not a super exciting answer, and I mean, he's already owned, but I think we could see an uptick in Woods' value while Kupp's sidelined.
And any predictions this week, Woods? I know you predicted Goff's 5-touchdown game a couple weeks ago. Does this change any of your predictions?
Yeah, my prediction is that he is not going to throw 5 touchdowns this week. Well,
6.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, anything's possible there. Believe in Sean McVay. Well, Kupp, we talked about the Kupp injury and another injury here. Definitely not as big fantasy-wise, but Josh Allen being sidelined for at least a few weeks, maybe longer. That's a big one for the Bills. Even before that, I mean, he didn't look like he was going to be much of a fantasy asset this year, but I think some of the other rookie quarterbacks at least have a chance to be, obviously, first rounders, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Lamar Jackson. I mean, he's behind Joe Flacco now, but, one injury away, and he could be a potential fantasy star. Mike, which of the rookie QBs do you think has the best shot at being a fantasy starter as we move along in the season here?
It's still Baker Mayfield for me. He was my number one quarterback coming into the draft, so it was shocking that the Browns made what I thought was the right pick with the number one overall selection. I'm not a big fan of the ankle injury. That was really unfortunate for Baker. If you didn't see the play, I mean, while he was running out, basically stepped on a piece of equipment and rolled his ankle a little bit. He was able to finish. His matchups coming up are just so juicy, including this upcoming week. I think that this is the week that Baker can actually get it going, and they're lacking confidence. I'm going to bring up a player when we're talking about guys that are being overlooked that I think is just lacking confidence right now, and they're lacking a bit of just that mojo because the first overall draft pick was not getting reps in training camp. You boobs, what are you doing? And now they're forced into a position where they got to play him. But Baker, if any of them, and then Sam Darnold would be the close second, who's been the Jets have been shockingly good the past couple of weeks. So we'll see if they can get it going. I just like the weapons a little bit more on the Browns.
Yeah, I'm with you with Mayfield too. That the schedule you talked about there. Bucks, Steelers, Chiefs, Falcons. That's his next month. Just a beautiful month. I mean, the Steelers have been a little bit better since Hayden came back, but those are 4 of the worst pass defenses in the league. And if you look at his schedule the rest of the way, he doesn't have a really tough matchup until the Ravens in Week 17. And that's tucked away in Week 17 when your fantasy championships should not be. Hopefully the fantasy season is over for you at that point. But yeah, Mayfield definitely my choice there. One guy you didn't mention, but he still has a shot, I would say. How about Kyle Lauletta? I mean, if Eli continues to struggle, we know there's a lot of weapons in New York. Odell, Shepard, Barkley, Ingram looks like he's going to come back here. I mean, that leads us to the Monday Nighter this week. I think everybody in the fantasy world, probably wants to be done with Eli after last week's performance. Against that, what is normally a pass funnel defense of the Eagles, and Eli had a ton of success against them in recent years. Totally craters on Thursday Night Football, but he gets the Falcons on Monday night, and they are the elixir that cures everything that ails an offense. So, Mike, can you trust Eli? Are you willing to put him in as a streamer this week?
Yeah, he's my stream of the week this week. It's too good, man. The Falcons are letting everyone score. Has there been a quarterback who hasn't put up a top 12 performance against this team? I think off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember. I think there has been one who didn't put up the numbers on the Falcons. It's too good. This is the get right game for Odell Beckham. Evan Ingram is going to be back on Monday, and that's a huge deal to this team. So yes, I will stream him. Maybe maybe you don't watch the game. How about that? Just plug him in your lineup. Don't watch it, because there's going to be tons of times where you put your face in your hands and go, why did I stream Eli Manning? But at the end, you'll have the points and you'll be okay.
Woods, are you willing to put him in your lineup and maybe say a little prayer and just hope?
Yeah, I think that's the right take. I mean, the problem with Eli, I think, largely is that he just doesn't have arm strength anymore, but that's not going to hurt him against this Falcons defense that was sort of designed to allow short passes to running backs and let Deion Jones and his speed sweep it up. Well, Jones obviously is on IR, so those dump-offs to Saquon Barkley and those slants to Odell Beckham should work fine against this defense, and those yards still count when Beckham takes it 60 yards to a touchdown. So this is maybe the only week the rest of the season I feel good about starting Eli.
I mean, we saw Barkley, taking some of those short passes and turning them into long plays against the Eagles defense. I can't even imagine what he's going to do against the Falcons. And Barkley, not a guy that's being overlooked this week at all, but let's talk about some players that might be. Mike, we'll let you go first. Who's being overlooked in week 6?
All right, so the guy, I alluded to him, and he's being overlooked, I think, because us in the fantasy industry are tired of talking about him because he's been so disappointing, but that's Antonio Callaway. The Browns are lacking. They're lacking people at the wide receiver position, and I just mean actual bodies of healthy people who can come in and play. The Buccaneers are one of 6 teams to have already allowed 10 or more touchdowns to the wide receiver position. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have only played five games, while most of the rest of those teams have already played 6. Callaway has the 12th most air yards in the league, according to airyards.com. Of those guys in the top 12, he has by far the largest discrepancy of air yards to actual receiving yards. They've just been missing. Jarvis Landry has just been missing as well, but I mentioned I think this is the game where Baker Mayfield and the Browns actually get things clicking. So Antonio Callaway, I'm tired of talking about him. You're tired about hearing about him. So let's see him come through this week.
And efficiency-wise, he has just been so
He's
bad.
been the worst, man.
Somebody has to catch the ball there, right? It has to happen. And yeah, what a matchup. Woods, how about you? Who's being overlooked?
I think that's a really interesting call, Callaway, because I sort of had the same logic, but then my conclusion went to a different place, which was that I picked Duke Johnson as overlooked this week. All the same reasons. The Browns don't have a lot of options at receiver right now. Baker Mayfield's got to throw it to someone, and we like the schedule. We like Mayfield. We're going to have to like some of his receivers. Johnson, I think, is someone they need to use a lot more. That he's very adept as a receiver. They can put him out in the slot. They can split him out wide if they want. They can throw him dump-offs out of the backfield. I think he should catch a lot of passes. I'm not fully confident that the coaching staff is going to see it and do it. I saw Johnson was asked today, like, should you just play receiver for this team with all the injuries? He sort of hinted like, maybe I should, but I don't think I'm going to. But that doesn't mean he can't get on the field along with their other running backs. I mean, they can line him up next to Chubb. They can line him up next to Hyde and still throw him the ball. So I think he could see a significant uptick over the next little bit here, and I like Duke Johnson as my overlooked player.
For sure. Everybody's all in on the Browns this week. What about Willie Snead? I'm not a big narrative guy, but come on. I mean, I admit that he's a better PPR option than a standard option, but he's going against his old team, the Saints. And Snead, a revenge game. There it is. 5 catches and 50 yards in 4 of his 6 games this season. He saw 10 targets last week, caught 7 of them for 60 yards. And like you mentioned, the revenge game, there it is. He's going up against the Saints. I expect that he is going to have a solid outing in this one. All right, everybody, take all that information and use it to make the best possible lineup decisions this week and the best possible fantasy decisions moving forward. Make sure you're following Mike on Twitter at FFHitman and checking out all the content by the fantasy footballers, including their great podcast. Mike, it was a pleasure having you on. Thanks, man.
It's been a privilege, my man. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Woods and I are going to be back on Sunday night with a full breakdown of all the action from Week 7, including our fantasy takeaways and the players that you should be picking up on the waiver wire. We're going to give you an early look at some of those guys. If you want to get in touch with Woods and maybe even splice a few clips of Patrick Mahomes with clips of Woods talking, can
he sing Rainbow Connection?
I will not be singing. Does anyone know what's the opposite of helium? Maybe next time I got to take some of that and lower this voice. There is? I got to get some of that.
There is a gas. There is a gas that you can inhale like helium and it will drop your voice.
We're gonna have to talk off the air about this.
Or maybe someone else has a better comparison that they could make for your voice. Either way, you can find Woods on Twitter at David P. Woods. Check out the Score app for all our fantasy content. You can get my rankings there, start sit advice, all kinds of great stuff. And if you have any fantasy questions, hit me up on Twitter at Justin Boone. Big thanks to Mike. Big thanks to everybody out there. And we will see you next time.
Said leave on time, my baby said leave on time.